Hello, I'm Alison Cousins and I volunteer at the Wandle Industrial Museum in Mitcham. This talk, Lavender, Mitcham and Beyond, is an edited version of one of the talks that the museum can offer. But it is not an in-depth guide to growing lavender, please note. So there was never an actual Mitcham lavender. The Mitcham growers are often accused of producing oils with a high camphor content, but this was not considered suitable for the finest perfume. Mitcham does, however, have its own rare and much sought after black Mitcham mint, as used by Fortnum & Mason. The essential oils produced from mint were actually more lucrative than lavender. There are actually several classifications of lavender, but we're only going to look at the two main types here on the screen. On the left, we have a hybrid angustifolia called intermediate. Angustifolia and the stoicas are the two main types. Angustifolia is a true lavender. It's fairly hardy, up to about -15 degrees. Has a long spike, thin head, whereas the ones on the right are stoicas and have little ears. So they have been called butterfly lavender. They're only reasonably hardy. They also have been known as French lavender, but that's actually now misleading. Allegedly, if you deadhead them through the summer, you can get continuous flowering, but I cannot prove that. I'm going to show you now a few examples of lavender specimens in my garden. Cedar Blue is very hardy, highly scented, and has short stems with pale purple flowers. Lavenite Petite, as its name suggests, is short. This is an EU plant variety, so it's protected. So you're not supposed to propagate it, but of course now we're out of Europe, this could change. Hidcote is well known and very popular. Arctic snow, as you would suggest, is white. And again, short-stemmed. Whereas Grosso has long stems and gets incredibly floppy. But it is the most widely grown lavender in the world for oil production and has a high camphor content. Munstead is named after the garden of Gertrude Jekyll at Munstead Woods. It's quite compact, so it's very popular for borders. Twickel Purple is named after Castile Twickel in Holland. Peter Pan has one of the shortest stem varieties that you can get, as its name suggests, with little stubby flowers. Silver Sands has beautiful silvery foliage. Melissa is my favourite. Melissa is very blousy and sumptuous and is also EU protected at the moment. And finally, Loddon Blue, very sweet scented, mid-purple flowers, and very popular in parks and gardens. Now, to propagate lavender, you really need to take cuttings. You can grow from seed, but it's a very lengthy process. So what you can do, take a cutting in early summer before the stuff gets too dry. Choose 2 to 3 inch shoots, which are just hardening, but without flower heads. Trim under the leaf node, remove the lower leaves, and plant into half compost and half horticultural sand. That's the official version. You can just plant into soil, which we have done reasonably successfully. You can have several cuttings in one pot, as we've done here, because at least 1 or 2 will survive, or you could just have one. When you plant out, you probably know lavender needs full sun and well-drained soil, so the loam over the Wandle gravel soil was ideal. Plant out between May and September while the soil is still warm, roughly 18 inches to 2 foot apart in old money. If you want colour right through the summer, select a variety of types, which will flower from June to late August. Commercial growers say they get more questions about pruning than anything. So this slide shows you the various stages of pruning. At the front, unpruned. In the middle, pruned after flowering. and at the back after a second tidy up. Growers recommend pruning as soon as the flowers fade, and certainly no later than mid-August. So this year that would already be far too late. Go about 1/3 into the foliage, but never into old wood, unless there are signs of shoots. Do a second tidy up in the spring, because this sharpens the shape of the bush, and I can recommend that. Modern varieties can last up to 15 years, but use your judgment. In Mitcham, when the commercial bushes were ploughed up as they became too woody, they were either used for thatch on the sides of sheds, or more often than not, stored until bonfire night. So let us look at the history, the cosmetic and medicinal uses of lavender. We know they probably came to southern England with the Romans, who used it in bath oils and as an antiseptic. In the Wandle Valley, the first evidence is round about 1300, when Merton Priory received from its grange, which is a monastic farm, at Eton, 44 quarters of spiking, which most scholars understood to be referring to lavender. Although Merton Priory had an infirmary garden, no evidence of lavender growing was found during excavations, apparently. So this income had to be surrendered to pay for Edward I's costly overseas wars. And I read that that includes Scotland, which to my mind is not overseas. Remember that Edward I was known as the Hammer of the Scots. Anyway, possibly as much as 500 kilos was sourced from all of the priory estates. In Elizabethan times, it was used to freshen linen, or made into polish, mixed with beeswax and strewn over the floor to counteract the stale odours, both household and personal. Here we see Ham House, an example of a Tudor knot garden. There's a geometric design with the box hedge surround and beautifully trimmed lavender. Allegedly, the Pilgrim Fathers took lavender to the New World, but they discovered it wasn't suitable for the climate. It wasn't grown on a commercial scale in Mitcham until the latter part of the 18th century, by which time there were 280 acres of physic garden in the village. And Chelsea Physic Garden couldn't cope with demand up in town. Before pharmaceutical drugs, medicinal herbs were the only source for healing remedies. Culpeper's Herbal suggests that lavender could help reduce blood pressure, induce sleep, heal burns and wounds. Of course, in Mitcham, it helped to counteract the smell from the varnish factories and was used to flavour some of the famous Mitcham snuff. By 1881, Mitcham had become the principal centre in England for growing and distilling lavender and other herbs, and had as many as 14 shared stills. Many local street names and street signs reflect this. Victorians loved their lavender water, but this fell out of fashion by the late 20th century. Lavender was crafted into sachets and bags, and one Victorian lady allegedly had scented saddlebags over the arms of her armchairs. To dry your lavender, cut the stalks just as the full colour of the flower is visible, but before they're fully open. Hang in bunches in a dark and dry room with the heads downwards, and tie in a paper bag to catch the flowers as they dry. If you tie the bag with an elastic band, as the stalks dry and shrink, the band will contract with them. So don't use string. Here we have a Tussie-Mussie, also known as a faggot, which I don't think is quite as elegant. It's a sample of what you can do if you have the skill and the will. And you can hang this in your wardrobe and get a lot of lovely fragrance. You take a bunch of lavender, you turn the heads of the bunch inward, and you weave a ribbon through. That's all. But personally, I think I would lose the will to live trying to do that. This depiction of the Borough of Merton is a painting, but it looks like a tapestry. The original is in the Mayor's Parlour in the Civic Centre in Merton. Those of you who know Merton well appreciate that the orientation is totally fictitious and the Wandle is nowhere near so ubiquitous. Lavender picking is going on in the fields on the top right. The coat of arms of Mitcham. Sprigs of lavender adorn both the shield and the crown. The green bit is Mitcham green. The waves represent a river or a ford. And the keys and sword are those of St. Peter and St. Paul, Mitcham's patron saints. And the crown is the symbol of civic government. Mitcham became a borough on Charter Day, September 1934. School children were given lavender-coloured beakers with a crest on them, and there was a souvenir issue of the Mitcham Mercury. One float on that day in the parade was from Potter and Moore, about whom more later on. So, how do we get the lavender? This is how lavender was picked back in the day. The best yields were obtained if cutting took place after a few good sunny weeks when the oil content would be highest. Lavender for market sales was cut a week before any used for distilling. As you can see, cutting was done by hand. They used a small sickle or a locally made bagging hook. The stalks were placed head inward on a piece of coarse sacking, which is called a bass. And then it was folded over into a bundle, which is called a mat, in 100-weight lots. Today, this is an example of how it's done. This comes from the hop shop at Castle Farm in Kent. They bought this modern harvester from the Provence area in the south of France. And our thanks to the farm for allowing us to show this. Again, back in the day, these mats were then loaded onto carts. The gentleman at the back in the middle with a sort of smock, I always assumed he would be an ancestor of Eddie Grundy. But having said this at most of my talks, one lady said, "I'm sorry, but that is one of my ancestors, and I'm pretty sure." So my apologies, but I still think it's Eddie Grundy. It's a jolly chap. In Victorian times, casual labour was in short supply, especially as the lavender and peppermint harvests actually coincided. So children had to help. However, surprise, surprise, this affected school attendance. And at the end of the 1880s, the authorities got worried and started to offer prizes to attract them back. But also in the 1881 census, there was a total of 230 gypsies recorded as living on Mitcham Common, and they would provide this workforce prior to going off down to Kent to pick hops later on. The next procedure was the distilling, and the lavender had to be dried for that. And the flowers and stalks were first dried in lofts, which were above the stills. For purity's sake, lavender oil had, for medicinal use, had to be extracted from the flower heads only. This was very time consuming and took about 6 hours to reach the amount required to fill the still. Sometimes the flowers were trodden down to compress the space, usually a job for the women or boys, but here you can see them grown men doing it. This is J&G Miller's distillery. And most of the main growers distilled their own flowers and those of smaller growers. Work went on day and night from August or September for several weeks doing this. Distilleries were two-storey buildings with the copper stills built into brick furnaces with ladder access to the top area. Mitchams were the largest in the UK. Most took about 500 weight of flowers at one time. The still was filled with boiling water, the copper head sealed with clay, and once the fire was lit, it took about 2 hours to get up to steam. Then the oil-laden vapours would pass into this coiled worm, which you can see, and from the head of the still, where the end was immersed into a wooden vat on the right. The product was then cooled before they could take any action on it. Water and oil were eventually separated into a copper container. The oil rose to the top, so it was easily skimmed off. And the best oil came from the first couple of hours. It was then decanted into quart jars, roughly graded, and kept months to mature. The remaining water you get is then lavender water. The stalks which were spent were winched up and chucked into the yard to be used as mulch to inhibit weeds in the market gardens around Mitcham. This was taken at Miller's. There was a huge variation in the details of the whole process, probably due to the inaccuracy and inconsistency of the statistics taken and a reluctance to declare yields to any competitors. But an average yield might be 12 to 15 pounds of oil per acre. But of course, this would be affected by the age of the bushes and the weather. So who were the growers and distillers of the lavender? This shows our museum display, showing a variety of items, mostly from Potter and Moore. And there is a close-up. Some of the bottles still contain fairly potent fragrances. In fact, I've almost knocked out several care home residents by allowing them to sample the perfume, which has been a little bit stronger than any of us had imagined. So Potter and Moore were the best known for their Mitcham lavender. They were a family business which went down several generations. They were both good nurserymen and good businessmen. That's quite rare. They were established right about the 1720s with Henry and John Potter alone. They were physic gardeners with just a few acres. And then John's son Ephraim joined up with a William Moore to build a distillery around about 1749, specifically to produce lavender water. This was near Figgy's Marsh, probably Everleen Road. And here's an example of their calling card and the lavender cellar going up into town. The first really successful commercial grower was James Potter, who started in 1768. Then his nephew, James Moore, added 250 acres for the company at Tamworth and Big Inn Manors. The buildings of the distillery complex included the manor house, stabling, carpentry, wheelwright, blacksmith. They were located opposite what is now Renshaw's Corner. He died in 1841, and his son James Bridger took over, by which time it was the largest Mitcham distillery and employed 40 men and boys. He died in 1885, but had no male heirs. So the company was sold to W.J. Bush around 1886 to 88. They kept the name on, but by then the industry was already on the wane. The Figgy's Marsh distillery was demolished and distilling equipment sold to J&G Miller of Carshalton. And bad news to follow. In 1933, there was a massive explosion in Bush's Belgrave roadworks. It caused the death of a young boy and considerable local damage, as can be seen. Despite all this, the Potter and Moore name was still strong in the mid-20th century, and stars such as Gracie Fields and Jessie Matthews used their products. Bush later became part of Albright and Wilson, who then sold the Potter and Moore name to DeWitt & Co. in 1968. And it's now owned by Crichtons since 2003. Another company, though lesser known, was John Jakson & Co. This was founded by a French chemist, Philippe Lelasseur, who leased a former perfumery factory in Croydon Road around 1882. And here we have some members of the family. Family moved into Mitcham Villa, and he bought the freehold of the distillery site and added yet further property. Here we see Jackson's wagon advertising both the peppermint and lavender and actually specifying the process inside of the factory. He originally bought his lavender from local farms but felt that as a foreigner he was being overcharged. So he set up his own farms in Wallington and Carshalton. With his family connections, he was able to sell to the French market and won many prizes because the French perfume manufacturers had complained they couldn't get a sufficiently pure oil locally. He used modern steam-powered equipment as this enabled a unique method of purity filtering. He traded as John Jakson and Co., thinking this sounded more English. But why the C was omitted from the name, we never know. The company never really recovered from the loss of land and local labour after World War II, so they sold the distillery in 1949. Despite an effort to relocate to a farm in Sussex, the company was eventually wound up in 1959. But some of their equipment is now in our museum. Other local growers were the Sparrowhawk family, the first of whom was Mitcham-based, William, born 1811, and he had a farm in Beddington Lane. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a good picture of this family, which is a shame. After William's death, 3 of his daughters took over the distillery. Sarah Sparrowhawk, in particular, became a well-known local and popular grower, and her lavender water won prizes in the US, and she received royal patronage as purveyor of lavender to the Queen. She also grew chamomile and black Mitcham mint and kindly gave employment to local women. Good on her. We've heard about the Millers, and here are George and Eliza on the occasion of their golden wedding anniversary in 1919. And he still has this splendid beard. They grew mostly peppermints, although they were general market gardeners, on what is now part of the St Helier estate. Their heyday was the 1870s. And because they had inherited, quote, some of the former Potter and Moore equipment, they could claim to be using the oldest stills in the country. Selling lavender involved going up into town for the best prices. Some of the growers had stalls in Covent Garden Flower Market, but mostly it was sold by the street sellers. This is Temple Bar in the city. Prices at Covent Garden in high season were 60 shillings a pound, or bunches at 6pence or a shilling. This menu is from a P&O cruise and specified the Cries of London as one of a series. And this one shows the lavender cellar. And of course, in the 1950s, when the old Covent Garden market was still in operation, a local London bylaw forbade sellers to knock on doors or ring bells, hence the Cries of London, which had to drown out all the other street noises. Other traders who operated in this way were knife grinders and fish sellers, etc. The best prices were to be had in London, so when the roads to London opened up, obviously Mitcham's growers cashed in on this demand, and again, Chelsea Physic Garden couldn't supply enough. James Moore, for example, sent 4 horse-drawn wagons up to town every day, returning with cartloads of manure from the London stables and probably, quote, night soil, unquote. Here we have Mrs. Sally Sparrowhawk. She was a seller of lavender in the Mitcham area, especially during the fair. I think we can safely say her family is still well known in the Mitcham area. A few years ago, lavender in food was very trendy. And we had to be careful because the edible product was lavender essence. The lavender oil was only for cosmetic or medicinal purposes. The essence is extracted from the flavour element of pure oil because it has a low camphor content. And in the museum, we have some well-tried and tested recipes in the shop. Lavender also features in nursery rhymes and folklore
For example, Lavender's Blue, Phil sang when we were young. It was originally a 17th century nursery rhyme, and this is the original version. But in the 1950s, Dinah Shaw in the States changed diddle diddle to dilly dilly, which ruined it a bit. Local folklore included a house in Mitcham in the 1920s when the owner was walking downstairs and saw a middle-aged lady walking from room to room. But when she got downstairs, no one was there, but there was a strong scent of lavender. In the 1990s, the cottage was rebuilt and the fragrance was noticed again. But then again. So, demise and rebirth, bad news and good news. By the late 19th century, good transport connections in London were actually a mixed blessing because land prices rose and growers were offered good prices by developers. Also, synthetic perfumery oil had been developed, and in the mid-19th century, there were cheaper imports. In 1881, a fungal infection called shab destroyed a large percentage of the crop. By 1903, cultivation was definitely declining and land needed in World War I to grow food. One of the last growers was William Mitchell. He died in 1928. In 1943, Stuart Slater of Eastfields died. He was 91. But some of his family emigrated to Australia in the 1950s and founded another Mitcham, complete with a lavender and eucalyptus farm. And the former was started with a root of Mitcham lavender. Misons or Mizens were well-known market gardens in the Eastfield area, their heyday being in the 1930s. Alfred Mizon was also a JP and an MP. He came to Mitcham in 1866 to work for Potter and Moore, and his recollections are in the 1934 Charter Day Mitcham Mercury. Some Mitcham residents took their lavender plants with them when they moved south to Carshalton and Wallington. The last of the original Carshalton lavender growers was probably Godfrey Machel. He died in July 2008, aged 81. He lived appropriately at Lavender Cottage. So let's look at the revival and get some good news. This wonderful picture is of the gazebo at Mayfield Lavender. In 2000, Brendan May, who originally worked for Yardley, contacted Bioregional, which is a local charity, sponsored them to plant lavender in Munstead. In the first year, they lost most of the seedlings, but the second year was much better. Mr. May then bought the lavender from Bioregional and created the Mayfield Nursery with his wife Lorna. It's now hugely successful and proudly organic. Carshalton Lavender is a non-commercial outfit nearby where you can cut your own, one of the few places where you can do so. Our thanks to Brendan for allowing us to use this lovely picture of the gazebo, where you can sit and look out over swaying fields. Now, this is the beyond bit of this talk. This is Bleu Lavande, a retail outlet in Canada. It's been dedicated to lavender. It contains examples of everything you could possibly imagine could be made from, flavoured with, or depict lavender. Needless to say, I caved in and bought a few things I didn't know that I needed, including a recipe book in French, which has been a bit of a challenge. Elsewhere in England, lavender was a key industry, for example, in the Hitchin area from around 1760, and in fact was more successful than Mitcham by the 1890s. Although Perks and Llewellyn closed in 1961, the old shop has now been partly recreated within the Hitchin Lavender outlet at Cadwell Farm, in the village of Ickleford, near Hitchin. Isle of Wight Farm is closed, but in Kent there is the Hop Shop at Castle Farm, in Sussex, Lordington Lavender near Arundel, and of course the traditional Norfolk Lavender in East England.
And there was even a D lavender in Banchory in northeast Scotland in the late last century. This was recently revealed on Gardener's Question Time after a question from the Duchess of Cornwall, no less. Here are three of the main sources. I'll leave this up for a little while, but do check all these websites for what's left of 2020 because access and facilities vary. And of course, by July, August, most of the lavender will be well picked. The website for Downderry in particular gives a useful guide to plant height and shape. I can recommend that. This is Downderry Nursery. You can see how beautiful it is. Please try and buy your lavender from a reputable lavender farm or nursery and check that it is English. I can certainly recommend this one in Kent, the details on the previous slide. You'll find interesting varieties unavailable elsewhere because it's a scientific national plant collection. Nearly all of the plants are propagated there. The setting is quite spectacular. There's a huge walled garden, different lavender varieties, art installations, professional advice, and on a hot day, the chance to enjoy a lavender ice cream. So what's not to like? Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this talk and that you'll have a go at growing a few new varieties of English lavender as a result. And sadly, due to the current regulations, I shall just have to imagine the tumultuous applause.